You are listening to Fantha Tracks.
Fast ship. Never heard of the William Paul?
Should I have?
It's a ship that made the Kessel run in less than 12 parsecs.
What a piece of junk.
Covering Star Wars vehicles in less than 12 parsecs, this is Start Your Engines.
Don't get technical with me.
Here are your hosts, Paul Naylor and Mark Newbold.
You're listening to Start Your Engines. I'm Mark Newbold, and joining me today is my co-pilot in all things ships. It's Paul Naylor. How you doing, man?
I'm glad you put the emphasis on the P with that. Oh, thank you. I'm very well, my friend. Very well.
Good, because we've got a Star Wars Podcast Day episode to get through. It is, of course, 5 years of Star Wars Podcast Day. It's the fourth time Fantha Tracks has been involved. It's 26 years since Jedi Talk launched, the very first recognised Star Wars podcast on the 7th of February 1999. So we celebrate that every year. There are, in this year, I think, about 70 other podcasts involved, including 4 other Fantha podcasts, which, if you've been listening to all of our stories and shows today, this is the 5th episode of 5 Fantha podcasts that have come out on Star Wars Podcast Day.
We've saved the best till last.
How busy are we? What a joy. We are today talking about the Ubriquium, as we know it. It's the 9000 Z001 landspeeder. Paul, where would they know this vehicle from?
This vehicle we would have seen from the very first time that we saw Star Wars back in 77, 78, whenever we got to see it, depending on where you are in the world. It's a little spherical spaceship on legs, parked very neatly outside Mos Eisley Cantina. And it's one of those ships that probably on first viewing, you don't even know it's there. But it's there. It's parked up outside. And it is, I suppose, in many ways, the most traditional looking ship in Star Wars. It's the sort of thing you could imagine drawing as a small child.
That's a great point. I've never thought of that, because you quite correctly say it's one of those vehicles that if you don't know it's there, you don't know it's there. I mean, for the longest time, I thought it was a droid.
Yes, it could have been mistaken as being sort of something related to perhaps the half-domed droid that was at the Jawa sale.
The black one on the floor, yeah.
Yeah, very much like that. It's a good point, actually. It's the sort of size that puts it somewhere between spaceship and droid.
Yeah.
And in many ways, it's a shame it was never made as a mini-rig, because it would have been perfect size.
Perfect point to bring up, because you, Paul, as a collector of Stan Solo products, I knew of this vehicle, and a few years ago it was pointed out to me, so whenever you watch Star Wars now, you kind of in the cantina. But for the longest time, didn't know what it was. And I don't think a lot of information was ever attributed to it. It feels moderately recent that they've really given it a bit of a history.
I believe I'm right in saying that it's been attributed to be Greedo's vehicle.
Yes. And it was you that told me that. I didn't know this. Now, weirdly, I was with Paul Blake at the weekend.
Yeah.
We did Festival of the Force and I interviewed him on stage. Fascinating chat. So it was very interesting to think that I knew that you and me were going to sit and talk about probably the only vehicle that you can really put a finger on and go, that's Greedo's. And just on a brief point that comes to me as we say about this, poor old Greedo gets fried. In the Tales from the Cantina, Mos Eisley Cantina book, I think he gets turned into a goulash for Jabba or something.
Oh, nice.
I wonder who took his landspeeder.
Well, at least we know there was nothing wasted.
Nothing's wasted in Star Wars, is it?
Let's think, who could possibly have then taken that ship? I'm guessing perhaps one of the familiar Cantina creatures that we had from the second series of Star Wars figures. I'm going to say that not Wars. If he one-armed, maybe even dead. We'll go with Hammerhead, because Snaggletooth would have needed a booster cushion, and I don't think it came with one. So let's go with Hammerhead, old Mama Nadun.
Hi, Paul Blake here, Greedo from Star Wars A New Hope, and you're listening to Fantha Tracks.
Technical specifications.
There's not a lot of technical detail on this vehicle, but there is a bit. It was the 9000 Z001 landspeeder.
Manufacturer.
It was a Ubriquium model, and it was commonly used around the time of the Battle of Yavin. So I would imagine it was a fairly freshly minted vehicle. If you think about it, it shows you that Greedo was doing okay. He was a bounty hunter that got around the galaxy. We know that from the comics. But whilst he was on Tatooine, which feels like it would have been his home base because he worked for Jabba, he's got his nice little hot rod. We saw Book of Boba Fett were those kids riding around on those sort of Brighton Vespers.
A little bit too
clean. A little bit too clean. This had a bit of grime and grit on it, didn't it?
Especially when water was at such a premium.
Turtle wax must have been, that's what they used. It was modified from the 9000 landspeeder, which had been aimed at Uyghur customers, but it had flopped. So it wasn't necessarily a successful vehicle. It was the predecessor of the 9000 Z004 model. Now, I like that because it's a little bit like, you know, when you look at the Starspeeder 3000, which was the predecessor to the Starspeeder 1000, which makes no sense because it should be the other way around. I love that. And it was colloquially referred to as the Ubrick.
Manufacturer.
It was manufactured by Ubrickian Industries.
Technical specifications.
6.8 metres long. It's a lot longer than you think.
Yes, I'm just thinking, because I actually own one of these that was made by a well-known custom manufacturer, Stan Solo. Mind you, X-Wing fighters, they're not to scale with the figures anyway, are they? So,
but, you know, it says 6.8 metres. I can't believe it's 6.8.
No,
that's not
that seems
right,
a bit too big, doesn't it? That seems way too big.
I mean, what would you say it was if you had to take a punt? I'd say it was about 6 or 7 foot.
I would go with between 3 and 4 metres tops.
Absolutely tops.
Maximum atmospheric speed.
But it can go though. Maximum speed 160 kilometres. That surprises me. Like I say, when you look at it, it looks like a nest of coffee tables, really, doesn't it? But that thing can go, and its maximum altitude, there he goes, is 3 meters. So it can only get about 9 or 10 foot off the ground. So it's a skimmer. It's a real low altitude vehicle.
Crew complement.
1 pilot, but it can carry 2 passengers. And believe it or not. And I guess because it is sort of cylindrical, it can actually carry up to 6 humanoids. Could you see that? If they refitted the interior, could you see that?
No, I think a pilot and a passenger is probably the most that I could see in there. It's almost like it's got the coolness of a Mazda MX-5 and the practicality of a smart car. That's how I would view it.
Yeah, I totally see that. Here's another point that backs up your wonderful analogy.
Cargo capacity.
50 kilograms. That's like 2 bags of shopping. That's nothing. What's Greedo doing? Popping down the shops. Yeah, popping down the shops to buy blue milk and not an awful lot more.
Vehicle usages.
It was a transport and it was a civilian vehicle. So no one's turning this into Slave One.
No, definitely not.
But Stan Solo, we mentioned Stan Solo now that, as we say, they did a wonderful job in adapting this. And what you said a minute ago is so true, because if you think back in the day, and this is why I think Hasbro right now should be seriously thinking about mini rigs for the retro line, because you just said it. You could very easily go back into the mists of time, 77, 78, outside the cantina, which is a classic location, and there's your 9000 Z001 landspeeder waiting for Greedo to hop back in. Of course, he never does.
No.
And it's a mini rig waiting to happen, isn't it?
It is. I suppose, really, to their defence, the mini rig line started really with the Empire Strikes Back figures. But it wouldn't have hurt to have sort of gone, well, we'll go back and do a Star Wars one. They could have done it when the last 17 came out, for example. Could have dropped one into the line then. But yeah, it was perfect size, would have been perfect pocket money price kind of vehicle. There's not really a lot you can do with it other than put a hatch on it and have it sort of split in half at the centre like a plastic Terry's chocolate orange. Because it is actually seen in the film, it would have been a brilliant addition.
The mini rig point, if history had been slightly different and the Hasbro team or the Kenner team had sat down and thought, when A New Hope came out, we're going to do this thing called mini rigs. And it didn't happen for Empire. I mean, it will happen for Empire.
Yes, yeah.
But it happened for Star Wars and the Ubrickians in there, the Ubrick, as they say.
Yeah.
That's one vehicle in there. I wonder what other vehicles you could turn into a mini rig, because the only other thing I can think of is the Skyhopper.
They accidentally did release a Star Wars mini rig.
The Escape Pod?
Escape Pod, yeah. So the one that you had with the Land of the Jawas, you could have sold it separately as well.
Yeah, but there's not a lot else, is there, really? I suppose you could do maybe the Rebel version of the Troop Carrier. I don't know, but there's not an awful lot else you could do.
The Troop Carrier, on a similar sort of wheelbase, you could have the things that they used around Yavin for transporting people from one part of the base to another.
Yeah, little flatbed things.
Yeah, I mean, all right, it hasn't got massive playability, but it'd be a nice addition anyway.
For everything in one location, daily news, reviews, interviews, podcasts, video, and social media feeds, bookmark fanthatracks.com for Star Wars news 24/7, 365.
Lego have made a version of this, It's part of set 75290, the Mos Eisley Cantina set, and it had 21 minifigures, but in there was our 9000 Z001 landspeeder. Have you seen the Lego version of this?
I have. It's actually, in terms of comparison between figure scale and vehicle scale, it is probably closer to the stats that you got there. You know, it's quite large. But again, the same as any other version that you'll see of this, be it Lego or the custom from Stan Solo. I would love to see one of those actually in flight, because it's very difficult to work out how it would travel.
You said it's like the most classic version of a ship that you see in Star Wars, and because I think you think of that spherical sort of UFO type shape, you're right. You know, it only has a flight ceiling of about 9 foot, but it would be fascinating to see it lift off, the legs retract, and to see how it flies.
I would imagine it has to tilt in a certain direction, almost like a drone, I suppose.
Yeah.
I just think it's one of those vehicles that if it cropped up in a future Star Wars production, it would be an absolutely fantastic thing to see.
In the same way that in the Clone Wars, when Filoni put Walrus Man, Hammerhead, and those characters in their original outfits.
Yeah, just as background, little sort of like nods. Yeah, that was brilliant. Just to see it moving and just to see how they interpret that movement. And maybe even have it land and have a Rodian pop out of it. It doesn't have to be Greedo. Maybe Beedo ended up with it. Who knows?
Great point. Could end up at Jabba's palace. It could be one of those vehicles that ends up in the shipyard.
Just off screen, when we went into the Book of Boba Fett, we got Slave One. Maybe it was just tucked behind that in the corner.
Why not? I just wonder, because there's the Lego version. Stan Solo, of course, Stan Solo's not official. We understand that. But nevertheless, they did a great job with the vehicle as a vehicle that nobody else ever seemed to pick up on, apart from Lego, and only then as part of a broader set. I wonder what other manufacturers could or would do something with it. It definitely feels like it would be one of the scout-sized vehicles for the Jazzwares line if they wanted to go there.
Yes, that's a good shout. Yeah, I mean, they could either release it as part of a selection of smaller vehicles. I mean, you could even throw into that evaporators and all sorts of things. Who wouldn't want some evaporators hanging around by their figures? That would be amazing, wouldn't it? But even on the Jazzware scale, that'd be quite nice to see. And obviously with this big push towards Tatooine at the moment with multiple product lines, it makes sense to do something like that. Get that out there. Relatively simple to manufacture, I would imagine. And a lot of the stuff in there, because it could be, you know, you might want more than 2 or 3 evaporators, you're probably going to buy more than one of the packs. That would be a good bit of marketing on their behalf. I mean, I would imagine there's going to be a lot of people when this Hasbro Cantina lands, that as much as it's going to appeal to people who follow the vintage collection line of figures, there's also going to be a lot of people that are going to populate it with their original line of figures. So to pop a Ubrickian outside it would look absolutely spot on. It'd look banging, wouldn't it?
It really would. It really would. And the more we think about it, the more you think, well, you see landspeeders in Star Wars. You know Luke's got his, and there's other landspeeders on Mos Eisley and different types. There's like almost like a bark speeder almost that you see in Phantom, that you see back in Star Wars, and there's heftier ones. But you also think maybe the Ubrickian, as we think of it, that there would be more of those. That whilst it wasn't a particularly massively successful vehicle, it does kind of feel like the Reliant Robin of the Star Wars galaxy, doesn't it? You know, there would be. It's an affordable vehicle. Yes. You know, when I was a kid, I wanted a Sinclair C5 and I never got one. In Star Wars, I'd have had one of these.
Some of our listeners may not realise how tall you are. That would be the most cumbersome thing for you to ever have had.
It would. And I was this height when I was 14, believe it or not. So it could have ended badly. I could have been stuck under the 901 bus on the way to Birmingham.
Your knees would have been anyway.
Absolutely. So I think for this episode of Star Wars Podcast Day programming from Fantha Tracks, I think we've done a pretty good job of talking about a vehicle that is on screen for, how long would you say it's on screen for? About 5 seconds?
Slightly longer than Zuvio was in The Force Awakens, yeah.
And let's be honest, we know the guy that owns the Zuvio Museum. So as I say to any guest who sort of tries to play their role in Star Wars down, there are no small parts in Star Wars. Conversely, there's no small vehicles in Star Wars, apart from this one, because it is pretty small.
It's small, but perfectly formed.
Well, that's all for this episode. We shall be back very, very soon with a fully sized big vehicle from the Star Wars galaxy. I know what I'd like to do, but there's not enough stats out there for the Onyx Cinder, so we're going to wait on that one, because I'm not entirely sure that this thing is 6.8 metres long, but maybe it is. Who knows? But we shall be back soon, won't we, Paul?
We will, and I think possibly the Snow Speeder and its variants.
Come back soon, Snow Speeders and Air Speeders.
and all sorts of other things. I've got a song in my head now, and I don't even know what it is. But there you go.
Entertainment, it's all free.
Almost as entertaining as my shirt, but seeing as this is audio, you'll never know, folks.
Thanks for listening to Start Your Engines. If you want to be a part of the action and stay updated on all the latest Star Wars news, visit fanthatracks.com and be sure to comment, like and share on any of our social media feeds at Fanthatracks. You can reach out to us and send in your listeners' questions by emailing radio@fanthatracks.com. Subscribe, leave a review, preferably a 5-star one, on Amazon Music, Audible, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or your podcatcher or smart speaker of choice. And as always, thanks to James Semple for composing the Fanthatracks intro and our Start Your Engines opening music, Mark Daniel and Vanessa Marshall for our voiceovers, and of course the data miners at Wikipedia. Remember to tune in to Good Morning Tatooine. It's live Sunday evenings at 9 o'clock UK time, 4 PM Eastern and 1 PM Pacific on Facebook, YouTube and Twitch. And check out our Fanthatracks Radio Friday night rotation. It's every Friday night at 7 o'clock UK time for new episodes of The Phantom from Down Under, Planet Leia, Desert Planet Discs, Start Your Engines, Collecting Tracks, Cannon Fodder, and special episodes of Making Tracks, and every Tuesday at 7 o'clock UK time for your weekly episode of Making Tracks.
Coming up next on Fanthatracks Radio, it's Making Tracks.